We're very honored today to have with us Sylvia and Carolynn Wilson, who are sisters and residents of Collingwood, Ontario. Sylvia and Carolynn are direct descendants of early Black settlers to Simcoe and Grey counties, and they are co-owners of the Sheffield Park Black History and Cultural Museum, where they offer tours to visitors interested in Canadian Black history. Sylvia, they have many honors. Sylvia is past secretary of the Old Durham Road Black Pioneer Cemetery Committee and serves as executive director for Heritage Community Church in Collingwood, from which they come to us today. Sylvia is also an accomplished pianist, music teacher, artist, advocate, and legal secretary who has received several awards for music, community, and youth initiatives, and among which is the 100 Accomplished Black Canadian Women Award, the Order of Collingwood, and the companion to the Order of Collingwood. As manager of the Sheffield Park Black History and Cultural Museum, Sylvia designs, displays, interprets, exhibits, and documents ancestral information. Carolynn is past president of the Old Durham Road Black Pioneer Cemetery Committee, and she has volunteered over 75 years. She's not,
75
she's not that
good.
over 25 years. Yes. That was a slip of the tongue. Along with descendants and local citizens to restore this significant burial ground. Carolynn serves as secretary for the Heritage Community Church in Collingwood and promotes community programs. She too has received many awards, including the Governor General Canadian Caring Award, companion to the Order of Collingwood, and the 100 Accomplished Black Canadian Women Award. Carolynn is a former elementary and special education teacher who taught for the Simcoe County Board of Education. And I'm going to turn it over to Carolynn and Sylvia, but I just wanted to let people know this session is being recorded so that people can watch later. If you are uncomfortable with having your face appear on the screen, you can keep your video off. I would encourage you to have your audio off unless you're actively asking a question. We aim to create a community where we respect and honor each other and make it easy to share our gifts and wisdom. So please do keep your microphone off when you're not speaking. And when you are speaking, take your time and be as clear as possible. Instead of responding to a speaker immediately, you can also put your questions and comments in the chat where everyone can see them and I can bring them up. And we show respect to each other. There may be disagreement, but a disrespect is unwelcome, and I will step in if necessary. Please, anyone be encouraged to send me a private message if necessary. But I'm so glad you're all here, and having introduced Carolynn and Sylvia, I would like to turn it over to them.
Well, good morning. I'm Carolynn. So Sylvia. Sylvia always says she's the younger, so let's start with that first. Good morning. We're very happy to be here. And Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting us to take part in your program. So who are we? Sylvia and I, along with our brother, grew up in a close, knitted, protective community. And although predominantly a Black settlement, a few white neighbors became very close friends. And many prayer meetings and social gatherings were held in their homes while our church was being built in the 1800s. We are direct descendants, 7 generations on one side and 6 on the other. Born and raised in Collingwood, and we're still here on the same street just up from the church. And along with other descendants, we represent freedom seekers, freed men and women, Black loyalists, and those who traveled the Underground Railroad to the promised land, Canada. However, milk and honey did not always materialize. People of African descent, Black settlers, often traveled to heavily wooded areas in our area here, Simcoe and Grey County, and to other areas to avoid recapture. They built their homes, their settlements, including a church. And that church often served as a school, a training center, and a gathering place. And although many continue to experience daily discrimination in all sectors, they stayed in hopes of making a better life for their children. And Collingwood and Owen Sound became the destination. I'm going to have Sylvia talk about the church.
Well, as you can see behind us, we are sitting at Heritage Community Church, and it was the heartbeat of the Black community. It was not just a place for worship on Sunday mornings, but it was the focal point for security, for identity, for strength, for information, for education, for companionship. It was a comfort zone in the neighborhood. And just about every Black community you find established a church. And Collingwood was no different. Our community here, we call it a community within a community.
Yes.
There was the Black community was on the west side of town. And then the more affluent families and businesses were on the east side of town. But not all white citizens were on the east side. They were in our neighborhood too, or we were in theirs. And together, the whites, the indigenous, and the Black people got together and built this church. They purchased the land in about 1870. They collected, we say nickels and dimes, but to them it was like dollars and loonies back in those days. But they collected what change they could into little clay jugs until they had about $15. And then they put it all together and they put a down payment to buy this property on 7th Street. We've had 3 churches on this same site. The first church was called Little Chapel, and they built it at about 1880s. It burnt within a few years, and resilient people, they built another church on the same spot. It was even bigger and better in those days. They added on to it a little stoop at the front and a bigger room at the back that encased a Sunday school room and a kitchen. And I have to tell you about how they used the kitchen. The Black community could cook. They were used to cooking on the plantations. When they came to Canada, they worked on the Great Lakes as chefs, cooks. They worked in hotels and restaurants. A lot of them had their own businesses where they served the white community. But we love to eat.
Yes.
And we jokingly say that Heritage is the place we meet, greet, and eat. Back in the day, my grandmother's day, when she was a young woman, they would have what they called fowl suppers, FOWL. Turkey, chickens, ducks, and geese. The women would get out in the morning and they would pick and clean all the fowl. Then they would cook all day. And this is not just the Black women, this is the whole community. And the men would set up the tables, not just in the church, out on the lawn and down the street. And everybody came for the turkey or the fowl supper dinners. After everything was cleaned up, they had a concert inside the church. So this started like early in the morning and went till late at night. And that was community. They built on the strength of each other. They learned who the other people were, who were their neighbors, and they worked together. Not to say this happened all over Collingwood, because there was a lot of discrimination, a lot of separate thinking, and people were isolated. But for the most part, in this little corner of Collingwood, between 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th Street, and from Walnut over to Oak Street, that was the community within the community. But we can extend that because the people, the Black community that came to Collingwood came from outside the community. Oro, Medonte was a place where the first time in history, people of color received a government-issued land grant to be a landowner and to cultivate the land. These were the Black loyalists that served with the British when they were fighting against the Americans. And their reward for their loyalty was to become a landowner in Ontario. And Oro-Medonte has a little church with the African Methodist Episcopal Church built by the Black loyalists. It is now a national site. It is still standing and it has been restored over the past few years, but it's a monument to how the community worked together. The land wasn't always favorable for farming. So some of those landowners moved inland. And other people that moved inland were freedom seekers that came across the border. You have to remember that the upper United States were free states. So a lot of freedom seekers went to the northern states, but across the border in Canada, there were also Black communities. So they could go back and forth and transition from America to Canada quite easily. However, in 1856, with the passing of the Fugitive Slave Law that enabled bounty hunters to come across the border and snatch Black people, whether they were freed or enslaved or freedom seekers, they would just snatch them and take them back to the States to be sold again on the plantation. Solution? Get away from the border, move further inland. So other settlements developed. The Black loyalists from Oro already had land grants. So they would move inland as well because family members were coming or other communities were beginning. So you get other settlements like New Lowell, Sunnydale Corners, Negro Creek, Priceville, Mudtown near Owen Sound. So, and there's a lot of other little spots that have never been recorded because we weren't allowed to register our land rights. So we've lost some of that history, but the history we found have substantiated that the Black community existed. They were resilient. They came across conditions that other people would run away from or avoid completely or just give up hope. But our ancestors were headstrong, we're back strong, and we're determined to move on. They found a way around the problems. They set up their own little communities. And Carolyn will talk more about places like Negro Creek, where there was an established community of 50 families were present. They were there, but they've been lost to history. Priceville, another community was there. They had a school, they had a church, they had farmland, they had a cemetery, but the cemetery was desecrated and plowed under, headstones removed. The burial sites were covered up with dirt and potatoes planted on top of them. Their story was lost. You have Mudtown in Owen Sound that was just mostly designated for the poor Black families, but it thrived. Those people came out and started their own businesses. They might have lived under poor conditions, but they were resilient in progressing onward and upward. We have New Lowell, where the Coopers came out of. They were the Teamsters. They were the ones that made the roadways for other people. They cut the trees and made corduroy roads, laid the logs down so that the wagons could come over. They had horse and wagons. In the wintertime, they would go out on the ice in Georgian Bay and chip up big blocks of ice and bring it into town so people could buy it and put them in their sheds to preserve all their food and everything over winter months and for summer in the heat times. So we were resilient. We found means of surviving. So Carolyn, you want to talk more about the settlements?
Well, I'll bring that up. I'm so proud of my dear sister. We work together very well. I'm just going to mention here about Black role models. I'll tie this in, Sylvia. Although Black children had to attend school, that did not mean they were always welcome or it was a welcoming situation. Often white families would pull their children from schools that were integrated. But here's a story. 1950, our mother, Yvonne, addressed the local teachers and principals concerning reading a little black sample and actually singing darky songs in the auditorium every morning and promoting Valentine cards with negative images of Black people. It was another opportunity to raise awareness and sensitivity towards all cultures. And in 1956, those books were banned. But we saved the books and we put them in our museum because they can tell a story. Our Uncle Wilfred was truly gifted. He could rise above name calling where others couldn't. And Uncle Wilf, he decided to stay in high school where a lot of our cousins left. Wilfred Sheffield attended several universities, and upon graduating as a minister, he realized he would not get a posting as his colleagues would. They all said, oh, we'll all have some place to go, and you too. But Wilfred knew. Wilfred applied to the Black church in Collingwood and offered his services. And when the time came to learn if he would have a charge, the dean announced, sorry, Wilf, no placement. Wilfred replied, that's all right. I already have a posting. And not only that, he sent his resume out to Manitoba and Winnipeg area, and a little church out there accepted Uncle Wilf for the summer. And when he was about 86 or so, I heard that story, and I just thought, one more trip for Uncle Wilf. So I packed Uncle Wilf up, my mother, and an aunt. I don't know why I all did that, but I did. Flew them out, met the people out there. They remembered Uncle Wilf. He stood up in the church and he sang. I just smiled to myself and said, I can't believe this, but it was to be. 1957, Wilfred Sheffield was accepted in the First Baptist Church as the first Black minister in an all-white conference. And his placement was in Burkes Falls, Ontario. Uncle Wilf. Anything else to add on that? So that's fine.
I might just say that Uncle Wilf, he was known as Reverend Sheffield, but he was identified as, there goes the first Black minister in the all-white Baptist church, wherever he went on the street. And one time he was walking down the street and a police officer pulled him over.
That's in Burkes Falls.
And said, you, get in the car. So Uncle Wilf, being obedient, he opened the back door, sat in the seat, very prim and proper. So the officer radioed in, I think I've got the suspect. And the dispatcher said, are you sure it's not the first Black minister of the white congregation up there? And as he looked around at Uncle Wilf very politely said, I am he. And after that, they became good friends.
I'll just slide into the Black settlements in Priceville area. Well, 50 families, as Sylvia mentioned here, established homes on the old Durham Road. They farmed, cleared 50 to 100 acres, built barns, and of course had a church. Relatives often interacted and often intermarried. Well, 1930, a white farmer removed the headstones from our cemetery, buried them, and used one for a stepping stone in his barn shed. Another stone was placed at home plate in the school barn, school ground, and we found another stone on the main street. Gravel and rocks were dumped on the monuments when the road was widened. So we're under the road. No one said anything, but people knew. In 1989, concerned citizens reached out to descendants, and together 4 tombstones were recovered and the site improved. Out of something challenging, good can come. We served for about 25 years there, volunteering to raise awareness. And it was Uncle Wilf who told us reaching hands out can make a difference. We chose to be positive and we chose not to point fingers. And here we are today. The president, Naomi Norquay, and committee are caring for our cemetery. And if challenges arise, we descendants are there. We can write letters in support and to save it. And now there's I guess 2012, a beautiful pavilion was erected there, housing those forest stones. But the point is, down the road, looking ahead, there's 80 out there. So our hope is that someday the rest of those folks will be recognized and the tombstones erected. Sylvia, you talked about the oral church. I'll just add the Oral African Methodist Church. The property was donated by Noah Morris. And that links us to the North Buxton folks. Our dear friend Slita just passed about 96. They held the history there. But to donate land to the church was very similar here in Collingwood on 7th Street area. Our grandmother had land and property, and oftentimes taxes and so forth. But she and Pop-Up made sure there was land here for the church too. Sylvia mentioned the Negro Creek settlement. Yes, it was that little sign out there. That Negro Creek sign was removed. And it was the white neighbors who called. They heard of us working over there at Priceville. I remember standing on the street and the concern on their faces. They took the sign, Negro Creek Road, off, and they put a white man's name on. What are you guys going to do about it? Well, we said, we'll talk. Anyway, it was the local neighbors that sounded the alarm when our road name was removed and changed to Moggy without any public notification. This family, Moggy, had lived in the area for only 4 years. And of course, we've been there for a long time. A complaint was launched with the Ontario Human Rights Commission in 1995. And 2 years later, 1997, the road sign was deemed historically significant and restored. However, again, as maybe you've heard us on the radio talking about things the last few years, the sign has been stolen over 30 times. In this past 2 weeks, we had put up a little plaque on private property, neighbor's property, and it went missing. But the neighbors had a plan. They'd made 2 extra plaques. They put it up on the 3rd day there, so back. Things happen. We believe it's how you handle situations. Well, this February 2023, the Chatsworth Council passed a motion to erect a stone monument, listen this, in recognition of this early settlement. Mm-hmm. And here we are today, working with friends. Sylvia says it's community. Without the community, we couldn't have done it ourselves. And there was awareness and a respect. So, Friends of the Negro Creek Road, involving citizens, neighbors, descendants. We formed a little group. We're getting informal, but we all work together as consensus. Our coordinator is Ben Haywood McLeod, and he is the voice for us there. He was raised in that area, not knowing that Black folks were in that area. Mm-hmm. And this month, a few days ago, the Chatsworth Council confirmed property for us. So we'll send the link to Ellen, but you can check that out yourself. But kudos to the community, descendants and friends. Sylvia, if I missed anything?
No. The saying is that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes people to raise a community. And the Sheffield Park, that's one of the things we want to do. When people come in, you might be a visitor, you might be in search of family, ancestry and things, but we become a community. And through all of the stories, we are building an even better community. We might have the artifacts and some of the history and the documentation, but just having the stories isn't enough. It's sharing them and finding more stories and adding to the whole community story of Canadians. A lot of times we're asked, well, how'd you get here? Where did you come from? And we're saying, we're 7th generation Canadian. This is where we've been for years. We didn't come from, well, Our ancestors came from other places, but this is where our roots are. And a lot of Black Canadian history has not been documented or found or the stories told. So if you have a little bit of information in your family line, that's part of the story. And your little piece of the puzzle is important. We've done a lot of puzzles over winter. And when you get to the end and you're missing one piece, that one missing piece sticks out. So all of our stories add up to be the entire story of who we are. So when people come to the park, we'll say, look around at what we have here, but if you can add to it, we need to have it because it's important and it's going to build for the future. I was thinking this morning, how do we explain that we're building? Our ancestors were the foundation. They had to be strong. They had to be secure. They had to be united together and stand shoulder to shoulder in order to support the progress of what they wanted to see for their children. They let their children stand on their shoulders, and they're the first floor of the building. They're the ones that were able to go out into the community and build those relationships and open the doors for the next generation, the second floor. That generation is the one that's able to go out there and show we can work side by side. We can compete and be equal and be justified in what we're doing. They're building for the fourth floor. And that's the next generation that's going to reach up and be in the clouds and look around to see what's out there. They're building for the next floor. Those are the ones that are going to touch the stars. They in turn are building for the next ones that are going to look beyond the stars and see what is impossible for us, but what could be possible for the next floor. So all of those steps, all of those stories, all of those achievements, all that resilience means something. So we're continuing. The community founders, I'll say, our ancestors that came as freedom seekers, as Black loyalists, as refugees, as community builders, started something that is meant to continue. So being resilient, I think it's part of our DNA. We're coming across problems every day. We're still meeting the face of discrimination, racial injustice, social injustice, gender injustice, no matter what it is. We owe it to them to be resilient, to face those hardships and not be beaten down, but to say, hey, I'm standing on a strong foundation, and I have to be a wall to support the next floor above me. So that being said, amen. That being said, that's why we have Sheffield Park Museum. We're building our little small part of the next wall. And when you come to visit us, or you have a story, or we come and do little talks like this, we're working together. It's not just Carolyn and me. This is a group right here, and we're going to work together because we're all going to be resilient because we have a focus to preserve what we know, what we don't know, what we're going to find out, and what we're going to plan for tomorrow. So I think enough of us.
I think we've covered everything. This has been wonderful for us. It's inspiring and it's encouraging for us.
It is.
Thank you.
So thank you, Ellen.
Thank you so much. I see that John has raised his hand. John, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Go ahead, John.
There it is.
John, you can unmute. No?
Maybe he's giving us a high five.
Maybe
There we
he's,
go.
maybe,
Have you got me now?
yeah, I
morning.
can see, I can hear you now. Yeah, okay.
I missed a bit of the session because I'm in my car. I had to drive a boy to soccer from Brampton to Georgetown, but I'm here now. So I missed a bit of it. Did you tell the story about home plate?
Go ahead. Do you want to add that, John? I don't mind.
Do you know it?
He missed it.
Yes.
She did mention,
Oh, okay. Okay. We had a presentation at the United Empire Loyalist Association Toronto branch, and I don't know whether you know there's an association, but we
Yes,
had
go ahead, John.
we had a presentation before it was even dedicated by one of the early people when it was still called Priceville.
Yeah.
And he told the story of how in the schoolyard, one of the headstones was used as home plate. And you'd say, now I don't know whether I'm going to get the name right, but when they're throwing the ball, throw it to Isaac, throw it to Isaac, when it was a call to home plate. I don't know whether you told that story or not, did you?
We heard the name was Mariah.
Mariah, that's it. I couldn't remember what it was.
Right.
Did you tell that story earlier?
We just mentioned the plate here. We just
Yeah.
mentioned that it
We
was there.
didn't say about throwing it over, but that was throw it over Mariah.
Throw it to Mariah, throw it to Mariah. And did you mention that the stones were actually stacked and used to fill gullies in the fence line?
That's fine. Go
you
ahead,
did.
John. Add to that. We don't
I
mind.
missed the best part of your talk then.
Yes,
Okay.
we did. We
Yeah.
did. They would-
Sorry. Are you
No,
aware
No,
of
that
the-
was good. You're
Sorry?
adding to the story. That's good.
Oh, okay. And did you know that there is an association for the descendants of United Empire Loyalists?
Yes.
You do.
Is that the one from Nova Scotia as well? The link?
Not necessarily. That's the Sierra Leone story, isn't it? Right?
Part of it.
Only that's
I-
only
I would-
part.
I shouldn't occupy everybody's time, although I think we have until 11:45. But anyway, and I could probably talk until then, but I won't.
That's okay.
So we actually have a project in the Toronto branch, United Empire Loyalist Association, on loyalists of the home district. And Oro Medante is
Yeah.
part of the home district from 1836. So we would love some data from you folks about your ancestors so we can include them in the home district project.
We'd appreciate that.
Okay.
Yeah.
If we can after, maybe I can go online and see what your contacts are, but I would love
That's
to make
just it.
contact. And even if the Heritage Church or whatever the organization is, I guess it's the Old Durham Road, is it?
Yes.
Would like a presentation on the United Empire Loyalists in general to get a broader picture. Okay. Did you talk about Richard Pierpoint or not? You didn't.
No, we
specify.
didn't bring Richard Pierpoint in. We thought that was another area, but yes, we had a display for him at our museum. Go ahead, John.
Very, very good. Okay. And then way far away down in Cornwall, there is a plaque to John Baker for his service in the War of 1812. And fascinatingly, he served in both wars of 1812, the one here on our continent, and he was in the Battle of Waterloo as well. And he survived
very
and
nice.
came back. And he came back. A marvelous story. There are many stories out there, right?
I have a question. I have a question for you, John. You mentioned the home district.
Yes,
You must have a map. Do you have a map?
I
Back to the
do.
1800s.
Okay.
I do.
And
Yeah, we do, because it delineates what we're studying, right? And are you familiar with the historical atlases?
Well, this map that we had was a copy of early 1800s, but it did show the home district as well. But yes, I didn't know if you
okay.
had that. That was fine.
Yeah, you've probably got a better one than we have. As I say, love to share information with you, and
We
talk about
appreciate
talk about resilience. I loved your story about the signs.
Good.
Thank you,
And
John.
We'll have to
surviving.
chat.
Okay, so
We-
love
we
to make
hope-
contact. Thank you so
we-
much for your
We hope,
presentation.
we hope to meet. We hope to meet sometime. Thank you
Yes,
very
most
much.
definitely. Okay, thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much. Andrea, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a really interesting and of course in many ways also disturbing presentation, because you reminded us of things that have happened far closer to our own time than we like to think about. But one of the things I was wondering, I'm originally from Nova Scotia, where of course and my hometown has a a historic Black community going back to Loyalist times. And one of the things that I've learned about that really has impressed me was how the Black community and the local Indigenous folks supported one another and came together because they recognized early on that you know, the oppression of one was also the oppression of the other. And you did refer to that in your context, but I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how that all played out in your area.
Well, I know that I'm not sure of the particularly details, but when our church had those dinners that Sylvia spoke about, the early years, very early years, it was our Native friends, Indigenous friends from Manitoulin Island that would come over, and they would join in service here. And our grandmother and others would often talk about, they would say, what a friend we have in Jesus, in their own language. And when we had the dinners, they would come here to the area here and then return. And some of the Indigenous friends went to school here along with our mother. And they did share the differences. We find here in our own area to date, Andrea, that a lot of our Indigenous friends are on the street, and we try to support with other Native friendship centers, but the stigma is still here. It's still here.
Yeah, that's an alliance that needs to carry on for the sake of everybody, and it's something that I think white settler folks don't always recognize. So thank you for bringing that out.
We belong to a unity collective, Sylvia, and on this unity in this group is variety of cultures represented. Sylvia, talk about that maybe.
From the stories we've heard at our grandparents and great-grandparents' meets, is that family was so important. It was so fragile because they grew up at a time when your family could be just pulled apart. Your husband, your wife, your children, your mother, your siblings could just be taken. It was of no value of the relationship. It was the worth, the dollar value. So when someone came to your house or into your community, they became part of your family, and you just accepted them for who they are, regardless of their background, their culture. But I think what united all of them at the time was the color factor. You could identify they were different. You could identify perhaps they're going through the same thing I'm going through. Perhaps they have the same common enemy that I'm fighting. And you found unity in those situations. You didn't feel so isolated. Even if you had a different background, different traditions, you looked slightly different. And I think with the Indigenous people, it was the same thing. If they saw someone oppressed, even though some of the tribal unities were dysfunctional at that time, if you were in a Collingwood community situation and you were the only one, you would look for someone you could identify with to find some strength, some unity, some comfort, some security. And I think that's why a lot of the Black community and the Indigenous community, the Asian community, with some of the, I say the Caribbean unity, all came together because we had something in common. We needed family. And you found that in whoever would take you in.
I was just going to add to Andrea about mentioning about when visitors come to our museum, our white friends come to museums, we're very much aware of feelings. And oftentimes they'll start apologizing, and we say, we handle that thing. This is life. We and you were not there. But we do, that's something we talk about, or the feeling comes up in our museum. And we try to address that by how we act, for one thing, and acceptance. But then we can also show from the challenges of the early years of African beginnings and so for the Middle Passage here through the rest of our area, Heritage Walk explains how we work together and it worked. But I just wanted to mention that we're aware of that, or the feelings, and some people cannot, some visitors are not able to go through see the slave chains. It's a reality. And we just watched Cleopatra this week. Sylvia will tell you that. Just that one, then we'll close.
Yeah, we saw a movie come on TV. It's one of the old TCM movies.
Yeah.
So we said, well, let's just watch and see what they show as Cleopatra. And here was Elizabeth Taylor in all her makeup and the nice cut out dresses. And Mark Anthony was Richard Burton. And they had a big processional thing for Caesar coming in. Thousands and thousands of people crowding the streets and waving and cheering on for Caesar. And I said, Carolyn, this is Egypt. It's in Africa. There wasn't one brown or black face in the whole crowd. And I said, that's how our history has been shown. So when people come in and see our display of Egypt, and there's black pharaohs, there's black kings, there's black queens, and they're in Moses' time, we're dealing with the one God instead of multi-God theories. And people are saying, you mean Cleopatra wasn't white? And we're saying, nope.
But it is a shock for people, and we don't laugh. We really, because
we kind of giggle,
and
as we do,
because it's the system.
Yeah.
So we don't put blame on people. It's the way it was. But folks,
but we're saying the thinking that's been portrayed has to be exposed, and a new thinking has to come out of that. And it's the same with the slave ships and with the chains and the shackles. That was the old thinking. Now, how do we think about it? And what are we going to do about it? And that's what we're trying to promote at the museum, is look at it from a different perspective and then build on that.
And Ellen, good. I think that sounds pretty good. You folks might like hot coffee or something now.
Anyway. I see Claudette has her hand raised. So Claudette, please unmute and
thanks, Andrea. I was busy writing my thought, and you addressed exactly what I was going to ask about. But I'd like to expand it a little bit to what I observed in the museum. One of the things that Carolyn and Sylvia, I noticed, is the presence of different cultures taking leadership in going around and explaining. And the impression I got was, we are part of this. This is also, in a way, our history. And I say that not saying that they are assuming a Black identity. I'm not saying that. But it seemed to me as if they recognize that they have made some contribution. They want to continue. Would you say something more about that, please?
Are you speaking about the volunteers, Claudette?
The volunteers, and yes, and their
various cultures.
And so forth.
We know we've lost a lot of our elders in our communities. And we know we have to reach out, share our history so that we could all talk about it and not hold it just to ourselves. We had to learn that too. We thought, this is ours, we're going to keep it, we have to tell it. But we need Ben Haywood, we need other friends around us and support the Priceville folks to carry on. We can't be there all the time. But I think that's part of including volunteers. And then for February, your Black History Month, and for International Days, we include the unseen folks in our community who come from different cultures. They may be all very fair skinned, but they have a culture and a story. And oftentimes those friends change their names because people don't want to pronounce their names and so forth, or they stay to themselves. So we do include folks at our museum, share their stories, and meet each other and just talk like you had. Ellen brings us together, like you brought us together. The same here.
We're just a stepping stone, really, because for Negro Creek, it might be our ancestors that are buried there, but it's white landowners that are there now who are on the land and who are eager to learn the stories. And in their community center, they're telling the stories of who the people were that owned the land previously, the ones that cleared it all off and that started it as farmland. So it's the community neighbors who are extending our story. We don't have to tell it anymore because they're the ones living there. They're the ones that are the groundkeepers, and they are now the storytellers. So it works out that if we're not there to tell the story, who else will? So it's communities outside of our community that are going to carry on that legacy.
And we've had to make sure that we as descendants don't carry a feeling of retribution or ownership, or it's carried on. We recognize the past, we understand the feelings, but we've come this far. We come this far by faith, and we're not going back.
Thanks so much. John, I see your hand up, but you spoke a little earlier, so I'm going to invite Suzanne to speak, and then after that you can go. Suzanne, unmute, please.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good morning. You mentioned the fragile sort of emotional reactions of some white people to seeing the real stories of our history. And I have to absolutely admit that I have gone through that fragile stage myself. And then I was educated and encouraged to just do my homework and learn and be part of positive change and be strong in it. But, you know, I have a friend, he's about 87, and he was a very renowned journalist in Sugar Hill, Harlem. And he was a member of the Black Panthers way back, but he got frightened when they started to have guns. So he backed off from that and he became an educator. But he truly believed that Canada was pure and innocent and that there wasn't a hint of racism or ill treatment of our Black brothers and sisters. And I lament my poor education that told me also, and I was so proud for years, the Underground Railroad and Canada were such heroes. And I do, you know, praise Canada and and I'm proud of Canada for the good things that it did. However, I deeply lament my education that just, let me use the term, whitewashed the whole thing. How sweet and wonderful we Canadians were, and we were a harbor of mercy. Meanwhile, I know, you know, some of those stories about the East Coast, almost, you know, we didn't call it slavery, but it amounted to the same thing, using people for the advancement of white people and the ghetto communities that Canadians threw them into and that sort of thing. So I just want to say that, you know, first of all, I believe that education is so important, and what you are doing with your wonderful museum, I've heard so much about it before, is so crucial, and your attitude to it, you're so encouraging and welcoming, and I deeply appreciate that, because education is the key, like to know these things and to recognize that, as I think it was something Andrea said, so in such recent history, what things have happened, that we should be much more alarmed as well as encouraged by the knowledge. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Suzanne, I'm glad you mentioned that. My little speech, I had made a note and I didn't read it, but I talk about not knowing about the history and so forth. You're right about that. It was kept from a lot of friends and people, community. But I made a note here. According to records and catalogs, by historian Marcel Trudel, Trudel, 4,200 enslaved people were already in our area. And 6 out of 16 members of the legislature of the first parliament were slave owners and their brothers. So we wouldn't know. We didn't understand. We didn't hear. And in the archives, they're bringing out a lot of facts and notes and lists that a lot of us have not been privy to. So thanks to those scholars and researchers. Bring it on.
And I might add, it wasn't just Black people that were enslaved. Indigenous people were too. And they were shipped to the islands, to the plantations in the islands and to the States. The Fox tribe. Yeah. So when you look at people from other countries and you're saying, they have features like people over there, now you're starting to understand why. In South America, a lot of the statues there were African featured. They had the broad noses, they had the braids, they had all the jewelry and everything from Africa. And this is before the Europeans were there. So they were traveling back and forth. And when they became enslaved, some of the descendants were already there. So it's a hardship on everyone, not just the Black people. It was a hardship no matter who you were. If you didn't fit the image, you weren't counted as important.
Just to follow up from Andrea, you mentioned about the Indigenous friends. Oftentimes when visitors come to our museum, they'll look at me and they'll say, what tribe are you? And I'm saying, they say, you're Native. And they hear an accent. I've had that happen so many times. But then Andrea, I look at Uncle Howard's picture. Our Uncle Howard has the features.
And our great-grandmother.
And our grandmother of Indigenous. So I could be part of that. They could be part of my DNA. I wanted to mention that people see different features in us. So that feels good. Oh, by the way, we're Irish too. I wanted to tell you that.
John, go ahead and ask your question.
It's not a question again. It's a beautiful story that happened at the recent opening of the Spirit Garden. You're hearing me this time, are you?
Yes.
Good. At the opening of the Spirit Garden on the 30th of September. Beautiful spot. So during the grand opening, a fellow came onto the front and center wearing a Black Lives Matter jersey, t-shirt. And right away, 2 or 3 elders came over to him and started speaking with him. And he was very eloquent, so they understood his story. And before the ceremony was over, they introduced him as a new friend. But that's not the end. Shortly after, on the main stage, now I missed the speech, but I know it's just no doubt. Shortly on the main stage, he offered his presentation of all lives matter, because we were talking to Indigenous peoples as well, right? And then underneath his Black Lives Matter t-shirt, he had another one. And it said, they tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. So we share that story because they loved him into being their friend, and because it's a common story, right? A very quick thing. Early images of Saint Maurice show that he was a person of color. I don't know whether you know that or not. You do know that. Okay, very good. And then lastly, that Governor Simcoe abolished slavery in Upper Canada before Britain even did it. Okay.
Do you have that year?
Sorry?
You have that year?
Oh, well, he wasn't here for long. He was only here for 4 years. I want to say 1786.
I was looking at 1793.
1793, that late. But he wasn't here, was he?
He wasn't here then.
No. So that's a question to be answered.
pass.
And I know I have it at home, but I'm not at home. I'm in my car up in Georgetown.
That's fair enough.
That's something. And believe it or not, I am told, and I haven't double checked the sources, but I am told he did it with the help of Henry Dundas. Because people are anxious to change the name of Dundas Street. And a friend of mine said, well, Dundas had slave trade links. Yes, he did. He wanted to abolish it. And he not only wanted to abolish slavery, but he wanted to abolish the slave trade. You are not going to do that overnight. And much of the opposition to Henry Dundas came from those who wanted to get it done quickly. But you don't abolish the slave trade overnight. And there was a war going on. It takes time. Yeah. Yeah. So
And
anyway,
change takes time.
But
Yes.
also with Simcoe, they didn't abolish slavery.
Mhm.
They just said you couldn't import anymore.
Yes.
You could keep the ones you
Yes.
had,
yes, yes.
but you,
And
they
yeah, and
had
my
to be
aunt,
freed. They had to be freed by the time they were 21. So it meant they still were enslaved people here in Canada.
yes,
They weren't freed.
Yeah.
But they just couldn't bring in any more slaves.
And
Yeah,
the reason
but-
the reason it wouldn't pass, John, you probably had this too. The reason it wouldn't pass is that they too in Parliament.
Members of Parliament
members.
and the aristocrats were all slave owners here in Canada.
right.
That's-
And many
Yeah.
many prominent Canadians were slave
Yes.
owners, including
Yeah.
like the McGills and the Jarvises
Yeah.
and
Oh.
the Babbies. Like
Mhm.
I live in West Toronto, not far from what's called Babby Point, looks like Baby Point,
Mhm.
and which is also actually in the site of an Indigenous village. But the owners of that land were also slaveholders. So there's and that's, I think it was mentioned earlier, and I know that you mentioned it, and your experience of watching Cleopatra with Liz Taylor and Richard Burton is, you know, is kind of funny, but also
It
not
is.
funny.
Yeah.
It's a
Um,
learning.
it's definitely a learning. But you know, you think that you know things, you think you're, oh, I'm relatively well educated, and you don't know because it's not taught. And I think that's, I know that Deacon Claudette, who is just raised her hand again, I'm going to turn it back over to her, has done such a wonderful job with her programs that I've been privileged to be part of in raising awareness of this. And also as part of the follow-up to that program, some of us went up to visit your museum and learned a
Yes,
lot
we were
there.
pleased.
Yeah. So
And there is an awful lot that we are still not being told. And I think there's some, I want to ask later but after Claudette and Stephen have had a chance to talk,
Yeah, sure.
what progress you've seen. But go ahead, Claudette.
My question is, in a way, a challenge. We know that a lot of the Black history of this country has not been told. In your little area, we know that. When we look at Buxton, we also know that. When we look at Amherstburg, we know that, right? Sometimes we tend to figure it's only out in the East. My question and my challenge is, how are we going to make those changes within all of the structures that are so important? Because you talked about generations, and it reminded me of the 7 generations policy of the Indigenous people, right? We are building for generations to come. If the generations don't have the knowledge, how is this country going to move forward in truth? So my challenge is not necessarily to you, Sylvia, or you, Carolyn, but to us, the church community. What is our responsibility to use the resources that you have, to use the resources that the folks down in Buxton have, to use the resources in Amherstburg and all of the other areas, which some of us have gone to, And my challenge is to our churches. Why don't we take trips around to these communities and learn? And not only learn, but you know, like the young children. That's all I'm going to say. That's-
A suggestion maybe, Claudette, not everyone can make those trips to those communities, but if you have storyboards, if you get videos and have special programs to say, come and see, come and learn, come and listen, come and share, come and take part in, then you can do that in your own community without having to say, how do we get them out to those other places? Bring those places into where you are and bring those outside people into where you are and share your story from home.
We've done that.
Around the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a donut. That's where you start.
And applauding, that was good.